newsagents.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome, especially a warm welcome to those for whom it's their first cabinet, and also welcome to those for whom it may not be their first time. Lovely to have you all here.
They say that in British cabinet government, the Prime Minister is the first among equals. Did he really feel like the first among equals today when sitting opposite him was someone who had been Prime Minister for 6 years, been leader of the Conservative Party for 11, and had also won 2 general elections? Rishi has won none so far.
There is so much still to unpick about that extraordinary appointment yesterday, Lord David Cameron, now Foreign Secretary, but also all the ones who got away from us. Esther McVey, amongst others.
The Common Sense Minister.
The Common Sense Minister. Welcome to the newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
And it's Lewis. And later in the show, we'll also be talking about something that we almost certainly would have been talking about more yesterday, were it not for the upheavals in Westminster, which is the protests, the marches at the weekend, which I went along to, and the extent to which Suella Braverman, as her critics claim, did indeed make it worse than it should and ought to have been.
But we're going to start with what happened yesterday, or rather, what was already in place almost a week ago. We've now learned a little bit more about the timeline of that appointment. And I understand that David Cameron was actually sort of with friends at drinks on the Tuesday night. The offer came that evening, last Tuesday. He went in to see Rishi Sunak, we understand, on Wednesday, but they didn't agree to it until Thursday. And then they kind of moved to get everything in place for a Monday reshuffle. And I guess the PM could argue that there is enough global instability. We're looking at wars on 2 fronts in Ukraine, the Middle East, for him to think he needed a big hitter in the cabinet. I think that's enough of a story that he can sort of tell to the world about the importance of having a big beast in foreign policy. But I also think if you look at it now, and Soaps, you kind of made this point at the beginning, it feels a bit like a job share. I mean, you've now got 2 prime ministers round the cabinet table. And, you know, in America, you still refer to former presidents as president, right? There is a sense here that they must, on some unspoken level, now slightly be sharing that job at the very top of the tree.
We made the comparison yesterday with Peter Mandelson, him coming back into the government for Gordon Brown as Secretary of the Board of Trade initially, but really Deputy Prime Minister as well, to Gordon Brown to help him, and how he was then elevated to the Lords. And that is a good analogy. I think the sort of, in political terms, the more accurate one is when John Major brought in Michael Heseltine as Deputy Prime Minister, because John Major was this comparatively unknown, rather grey person in the way that he was seen politically, and not that exciting. Heseltine was certainly none of those things. He was exciting, he was charismatic, he was bold. And John Major decided he needed Michael Heseltine. And Michael Heseltine is going around saying, this is a wonderful day. I've never been more delighted to see, David Cameron brought in. Well, look at what happened in 1997. But it didn't change anything of the kind of fundamental politics.
Yeah, he still wasn't actually Prime Minister, though. And I think the difference here, and we've talked about it before, is that Rishi Sunak has come by this post as appointment. He's never won an electoral vote to be Prime Minister. And Cameron, staring him in the face, is the embodiment of somebody who has managed to convince the British electorate that he should be Prime Minister. And I think it's great for now. I think it's, it sort of gives him heft, and it probably helps sort out, a lot of the overseas problems with a bit more of a character in place. But at some sense, that is staring you in the face, that he must feel like, well, maybe he earned the place of being Prime Minister more than Rishi Sunak.
And I do wonder whether ultimately this is another one of those examples where this is a bit of political strategy and chicanery, which stunned Westminster, but that Westminster and SW1 ends up seeing very different to the rest of the country, in a sense that we all got very excited. The whole of Westminster got excited yesterday because it was such an unexpected move. It does give him some ballast within his cabinet. It does give him a sense of continuity with the Cameron years, which actually in many ways is a far better fit for Sunak than the kind of Johnson-Truss era was, and this idea of him being this sort of big change agent. But at the same time, in terms of the public, what do they see? They see a guy who they had thought had long left the stage. They see a guy that they associate with austerity. They see a guy who does not have, as we were saying yesterday, either an uncomplicated legacy in terms of domestic or foreign affairs. And actually, something I was really struck by, again, and it all seems so natural to us, he goes to the Lords. I was struck by so much of the social media comment yesterday, who actually from, social media comment tends to be from quite politically engaged people, who are saying, how can he even be in Parliament? How can he be in the Cabinet? He's not an MP anymore. And of course, to us, it seems sort of natural. It's like, well, he's going to be put in the House of Lords. I think to a lot of people, this sort of seems, particularly when you consider the last time that anyone actually really heard from him was in the height of the Greensill affair, for which there are still unanswered questions. For him to end up in the House of Lords in an unelected position, in a position as senior as Foreign Secretary, I don't think we can underestimate sometimes how curious and weird that will seem to the electorate.
Yeah, I mean, it is the back door. And this is something that the Speaker made very clear, and we raised it yesterday on the podcast, which is that there is no real place for him to be held accountable for those decisions he makes as Foreign Secretary. And your point on austerity, I think, is really key, because David Cameron left after losing. I mean, he left after losing a referendum that many, many people felt should never have been called, or should have been fought with a sense of threshold, or should have had much tighter rules around what we were offering or what wasn't being offering.
And which many people think was a foreign policy catastrophe.
Right. And even before that, we had 6 years of austerity, right? And I think that's absolutely key to this, that a lot of people are still actually suffering the effects when they look at what happened during the pandemic, what happened to the NHS, still in crisis now with a brand new health secretary there. We haven't even gone on to talk about that. What happened to benefits, what happened to the kind of cuts that were introduced long before COVID would make things even harder and even more difficult. We haven't even got on to those recollections because we're still dealing with the repercussions of Brexit.
I do think it's worth dwelling a moment on that whole question of democratic accountability, because I think that whilst it might excite kind of geeks who follow Westminster politics, how do you hold to account a foreign secretary who's in the House of Lords, and does the Commons need to rewrite its standing orders, and will he have to only appear before a select committee when MPs get a chance to question him, and what are these mechanisms? I don't think that actually resonates at all with the public. It's all a bit inside the Beltway Westminster politics. But I do think what resonates is this sense that politics is a game played by the Conservatives where the people are not consulted, and whether it's about getting rid of Boris Johnson and replacing him with Liz Truss, and Liz Truss falling and being replaced by Rishi Sunak, and when it's only Conservative Party members who get a say, and now we've got someone unelected going into the Lords who is going to be one of the most senior officers in the country, holding one of the great offices of state, and the British people are once again left out of it. And I think it will just heighten that sense of impatience that I think is really prevalent, of just give us a bloody general election so we can decide whether we want this lot back in or we want somebody else.
Voice.
And give us a voice.
And there is another sense in which the kind of Westminster box set, endless drama that always seems to have another episode, of which the Cameron restoration is part, is potentially not over, which is, of course, although, again, we're still very occupied. We saw the cabinet pictures this morning of Cameron and the kind of sheer intrigue of his being back. We don't yet know which was the more significant move yesterday. Was it Cameron and his return, or was it Braverman and her sacking and her dismissal? Because we've heard from Cameron, we've heard from Sunak, we've heard the lines from government ministers this morning about this being a more united government, more coherent government, and so on. Fine. But we don't yet know how, over the short to medium to longer term, the Conservative right is going to react and what they're going to do. And I think one of the sort of notable things about yesterday, which probably hasn't been commented on enough or hasn't been recognised enough, is that we are in this very curious position now where the Conservative right, which has basically been the dominant faction of the Conservative Party since 2016, it's become more and more dominant over time, to the point of, as you were saying yesterday, Emily, whole bits of the left of the Conservative Party literally being thrown out by the right. It's actually, in terms of its position at the top of the party now, in terms of the personnel at least, at its weakest since 2016. Yes. And that is actually a really quite significant change. So what's one of the net results, the most important net result of yesterday in a way, is that tomorrow, what we're going to be talking about? We're going to be talking about the Supreme Court decision on Rwanda. Had Braverman still been there, we would have been giving far more credibility to the idea of us withdrawing from the European Convention on Human Rights. That is something that she would have been pushing for if the Supreme Court decision goes against Rwanda. That seems so much less credible now, because there's no way that Cameron, as Foreign Secretary, is going to be negotiating that. It seems that James Cleverly, having previously been opposed to the idea, as Home Secretary, is not going to be implementing that. So in some policy senses, there was a significant shift yesterday, and we don't yet know how the right, in terms of their response, how they're going to respond over the long term. And indeed, the right, who I think are just a bit kind of like stunned about the sort of course of events and the fact that they've lost so much power within the party so quickly, are now working out what to do. Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's one of their standard bearers, was speaking on Channel 4 News last night.
It'll make Rishi Sunak look weak, not in control.
I think
who's the real Prime Minister?
Who's the real Prime Minister?
Yes.
I mean, I think David Cameron looks a very strong Prime Ministerial figure in the interviews he's done today. He's very good at the communication side of politics. That was one of his great strengths as Prime Minister.
But you don't like his politics, do you? I mean, are you happy with the political direction of this reshuffle?
Well, I think the political direction of this reshuffle is an error. That if you look at what people voted for in 2019, they voted for a party, actually right the way back to 2010, that would deal with migration and be tough on law and order. That's what Suella was doing, and the Prime Minister sacked her for following government policy. Now, she may have been infelicitous in some of the phrases she used, but that is, I think, the message that people will get.
Just listening to that, I wonder whether Rishi Sunak, how much he has calculated. What harm can Suella Braverman do from the backbenches? How much of the deal that was forged when she was brought back in as Home Secretary, what was promised to her? And because there are all sorts of words, rumours swirling around Westminster at the moment that she's got a lot to say and she could do him really serious harm in the process. And Suella Braverman, when she breaks cover and when she kind of breaks her silence since the firing, it's going to be interesting to see what happens.
Just picking up from what Jacob Rees-Mogg was saying, it's quite interesting that I have been directed towards stuff that David Cameron was saying back in 2012 about taking on the European Court of Human Rights. And I think that is quite significant, because I think what Rishi Sunak is trying to remind us is that domestic policy with David Cameron in the cabinet will not change, and that if we're looking to him to be a soft touch on Rwanda, a soft touch on immigration, a soft touch on ECHR, they're saying, don't forget, look at this piece in the Daily Mail, 2012, he refused prisoners the right to vote. They are hoping that they can sort of smooth over anything that we might be pointing to, which suggests that David Cameron isn't on the same page as Rishi Sunak when it comes to taking on the ECHR.
I think that is really important in the sense that there has been quite a lot of talk in the kind of the way that this has been portrayed over the last sort of 24 hours, that this is kind of like a return to the centre ground for Sunak. And I think it's far more complicated than that. We can't forget that in many ways, let's take David Cameron, in many ways, he was to the right, certainly economically, of Boris Johnson. Right? And Sunak is to the right economically of Boris Johnson. In that sense, there is a sort of line, a much better through line from Cameron to Sunak. In terms of policy, apart from stuff around the ECHR, because as I say, I don't think that they would, in a way that Suella would be willing to do, countenance leaving it. In terms of policy, so much of the problem that Sunak actually had with Braverman wasn't so much what she thought, which, as we've said before, actually they're quite aligned on. It's how she said it. It's the tone. And that is the difference. What you're moving from here is a certain type of Conservative Party, which we saw to some extent under Johnson, certainly under Truss, people like Braverman, which is constantly a politics of combat, of being pugnacious the whole time, of finding culture wars, to one which is trying to resist and resile from that a bit, because it's trying to shore up its more southern, blue wall, for want of a better expression, vote. But don't expect profound changes in policy.
Right.
It's about how they talk about it.
I also thought it was interesting that, last night when the briefing came out and it was the Sun newspaper that broke it, that Esther McVey was coming back into the government to be the common sense czar, and that she was going to be the Minister for AntiWoke. And you just thought, what does that actually mean? And is that a question of kind of Suella is gone, but don't worry on the right who like this culture war stuff, we've got someone else who will stoke it for us as well. Because in terms of a ministerial definition, there is Esther McVey sitting around the cabinet table, and as far as I can tell, it is to be the Minister for Common Sense, which kind of implies that the rest of the a bunch of idiot numpties who wouldn't know any
don't
common
worry
sense.
about them. They're talking absolute claptrap.
Yeah, they're all talking bollocks, but we've
She's
got.
the one who
But thank God we've got a common sense
This is what
minister.
her husband said. This is what Esther McVeigh's husband said about former GB News presenter Esther McVeigh on GB News this morning.
He is himself an MP.
Well, it's not. I'm not the Prime Minister, Andrew, who sort of sets the ministerial.
She must have had that conversation with the Prime Minister when she accepted the job.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think she's got to make the job her own, basically. Yeah. I mean, it's a new job, and so it's up to her to put her stamp on it. One thing that anyone knows about Esther, she'll certainly put a stamp on it. But I think the idea will be that she'll be able to work with government departments to try and bring forward some common sense measures, and no doubt there'll always be a role for somebody in the Cabinet Office to squash any ideas that are coming through that are not sensible and common sense. I think it's the Cabinet Office has that role to try and promote good things and squash bad things.
So just to get to the bottom of that, Mr. and Mrs. Common Sense GB News presenters, who are both MPs, sitting MPs in the Conservative Party there, you have her husband trying to explain what his wife, former or maybe still current GB News presenter, is doing back in the Cabinet. I guess the point is, and she's technically called Minister Without Portfolio, I think she might as well be called...
Minister Without a Job?
Well, I was going to say Minister for Culture Wars. And I think she's got a very key role, actually, which is not just to talk common sense, but to say to Suella, directly to Suella, we don't need you in here. We've got our own now. So if Suella starts shouting and rattling up from the outside and throwing stones at the window, we've already got Esther McVeigh to do all that stuff inside. So don't you worry about it. It's the piss, if you like.
Sorry, I would never use a metaphor like that.
She's already on the inside. She's got one on the inside, so we don't need one on the outside, right?
I think the question is, over the longer term, Sunak has tried to, as I say, create this through line between the Cameron years and himself. Only a month ago, he was trying to do the opposite. He was trying to say, actually, there's basically been all these prime ministers before me, including people from my own party, and they've all done politics completely wrong. Within the space of a month, that has changed. That strategy has been turned on its head. And the biggest critique of Sunak that you're sort of hearing, really, even from people who in the Conservative Party who are, quite sympathetic to him, is what we're worried about with this guy is that his political nous is very, very limited, because he is sort of trolleying around in search of a narrative. And how long is this one going to last for? And there are going to be practical problems with Cameron being in his cabinet and being Foreign Secretary in terms of stuff that comes down the tracks. Why did Cameron resign as Prime Minister? He resigned because he felt that he was rightly unable to maintain confidence of Brexiters, who were becoming more and more dominant in the party, and are way more dominant now, when negotiating with Europe after having led the Remain campaign. There will be negotiations with Europe to come over the course of next year. We're due to have a renegotiation of some description
to be fair,
of the TCA, the trade agreement. Will Brexiters be content with David Cameron leading that? If we do want to seek changes on the ECHR at some point, is David Cameron going to have to go to Europe to do a renegotiation with the Europeans? Oh my God, deja vu. And will he have the confidence of the party, which, as I say, is way more aligned with Suella's position now on all sorts of things than it was in his day, and when it was far more aligned with him? Will he have the credibility and authority to do those things?
The only thing I'd say is it might have been a canny move to get out when he did, because what he clearly saw in the tea leaves was that nobody was going to find the right strategy to get us through Brexit.
I think he
and
needed
no
to
one
go.
did.
There's no
he
question.
needed to go, but actually, look at what happened. It wasn't, Theresa May didn't manage to do it. Boris Johnson screwed it up and promised an oven-ready deal that didn't exist. Liz Truss still couldn't even get on with the French, to the point where she didn't even know if Macron was a friend or a foe. I mean, in a way, what he saw, what he prefigured, was it was going to be an absolute show for 6 years, and it was.
So before we go, we want to talk a little bit about what happened at the weekend, because we haven't had a chance to do so properly, and it was a really important, and actually in lots of ways quite bleak day where far right took control of the cenotaph, broke through police lines, and we had the absolute ignominy of seeing the far right basically surrounding the cenotaph on Armistice Day. And of course, when we had 300,000 people marching through the streets of London to show solidarity with Gaza and to call for a ceasefire. And I went along to it and actually felt quite disturbed by it in all sorts of different ways.
Why?
Well, I'll tell you what, let's just listen. So I spoke to a lot of some of the marchers, And obviously you can only speak to so many people. But here's just a sample, just a flavour of some of the people that I spoke to.
People, everyone here is here for one thing, it's for peace. We're not advocating violence, we're not advocating terror, we're advocating peace and humanity, and this is why we're here today.
But there are some people Jews in particular, who find this very scary.
They shouldn't do. They should be solidarity with us, I believe, and most of the Jews are. And unfortunately their voice is not being heard because the Jewish media is keeping that quiet too. So,
what do you mean the Jewish media? What do you mean?
The bias side, say like the BBC and all that.
It's not the Jewish media though, is it? That's just the media.
That's the media, yeah. So I'll refrain myself, it's the media.
From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free! From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free!
They hear chants like from the river to the sea, and many British Jews find that offensive.
Yeah, I expect they do, because they took the land from the Palestinians. I think the Israelis have just got to take that in their pipe and smoke it a bit. You know, they have done terrible things to Palestine. They've killed people, not just now, but over the last 70-odd years. They have taken their land, they've destroyed their homes, they've destroyed their olive trees. No, they've got a lot to answer for.
I have Jewish friends. One of my closest friends is a Jew. Even he believes there's no problem with Jews living there, Christians living there, anyone living there.
But from the river to the sea, it does refer to the idea of wiping Jews out from that area, doesn't it?
No. The river to the sea refers back to the plan made by the founder of Zionism. So it's not against Jews, it's against Zionists.
Hopefully it should make a difference by the government seeing what's happening is a massacre, it's a genocide, it's not a war between two countries, it's a massacre.
People who support Israel would say that Israel had to do something. I mean, the act of terrorism that they suffered at the hands of Hamas was appalling, wasn't it?
They've said many things, but there's no documented evidence.
No evidence of what? No evidence of what? That the terrorism didn't happen?
So I suppose what I felt about it is that so many people there, and of course, many of them, they just wanted to show solidarity, they desperately want a ceasefire, and who can blame them in many ways for that, in the sense of what we're seeing, the images we're seeing, so many children dying, targeting of hospitals, and so on. What I felt is that, it took about 30 seconds when I was there before I heard sustained chants of From the River to the Sea, which, whatever you think about its provenance and its history, there is no doubt that many Jews find it scary and offensive. And the second thing is that lots of people I spoke to, it just didn't take much to scratch the surface for some pretty basic questioning before, whether consciously or not, anti-Semitic tropes kind of threw up. You heard that one there about the idea of the media all being Jewish media and so on. I spoke to a couple of young women there who actually questioned, and this is where I think the kind of some of the anti-Semitic tropes fuse with sort of modern internet conspiracy culture, said to me, well, how do you know anything even really happened on October the 7th? There's no evidence for it. And I found that pretty unsettling. And again, I'm not saying this is completely representative. I'm not saying, clearly the march in the main was pretty peaceful. There were no attempts to sort of make it violent. The violence that we saw that day was from the far right. They're the ones who decided to go down there looking for trouble. And I have to say as well, in addition to that, I sort of went later and saw some of the sort of far right thuggery going on. 100% of those people were being deeply Islamophobic, saying appalling Islamophobic chants, which I won't repeat. So 100% of the far right were deeply, deeply vile. But I have to say there were some people on that march who were vile in their own way. And I have to say I came away from it sort of thinking, maybe if there was a world, I would never do this because I was a journalist, but maybe when I was a student, I could have imagined a world. Maybe I would have gone along on a march like that in solidarity with
I went on
Gaza.
plenty.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that having been there on Saturday, I don't think I would be, if I had been that student how many years ago, I don't think I would be comfortable going on another one.
I'll tell you the worst thing about this, Lewis, is that the gap that leaves is now being moved into by the likes of Tommy Robinson. Yep. And the people from the far right who might have been Islamophobic, who got to the cenotaph, and we all saw those scenes, but think that they're doing it in the name of British Jews, that is horrifying, And there are plenty of British Jews now who just want to move as far away from that kind of patronage as they can possibly get. And yes, you can say that this is a gap that has now opened up because protests that once would have been somewhere that many, many Jews felt absolutely at home and almost responsible and obligated to be part of if they believed in the two-state solution, are now places that they feel excluded from, and that whole void is being plugged by the voices that they have nothing in common with.
And I think that is a side of what has happened over the past few weeks that has been really alarming, which is the kind of polarisation, the going to extremes in viewpoints, and how much of what one would term the progressive left, so-called progressive left, with an anti-Israeli stance, anti-Zionist stance, that I think confuses anti-Zionism with being anti-Semitic. And I think that has been deeply discomforting. And, listening to Jeremy Corbyn, I mean, he was on with Piers Morgan last night. Here is a Labour leader who cannot condemn Hamas for having butchered 1,400 people in Israel. Now, whatever else you might think about the Palestinian cause and, on the simple cause of Palestinian rights and the human rights and all the rest of it, yeah. But when you can't see and bring yourself to say that.
Well, he wouldn't say that they were a terrorist organisation, right? That's what he wouldn't condemn them for.
Let's listen into it.
Can we have a discussion?
Can you call them a terror group, Jeremy?
Can we have a discussion?
Can you call them a terror group?
Is it possible to have a rational discussion
Are you prepared to call Hamas a terror group?
Is it possible to have a rational discussion
can
with
you?
you? Is it possible? Come on, answer that question.
You can't, can you?
You answer it.
No, it's my show. You answer my question.
Well,
are Hamas a terror group?
Listen, can I...
Are they a terror group?
Piers, can I speak?
Answer the question.
Can I speak?
Are they a terror group?
Piers,
no, then, no.
If you let me speak...
Are they a terror group?
If you'll let me speak, I'll say something.
Go on, then.
A ceasefire means both sides...
You said that. Are they a terror group?
Listen, I said that because
are they a terror group?
Part of the process.
Are they a terror group?
Can we go...
Why can't you say it?
Piers, can we go through what ought to be happening?
Just answer my question.
Why do you think
are Hamas a terror
nations
group
in the world are calling for a ceasefire?
I think he's outdone Paxman on that one now. We counted 15.
I think, John, your point is absolutely right about the polarisation, which is that the weird space that we've ended up in, where the left, and in particular the sort of more extreme bits of the left, so completely identify, so readily, absolutely entirely, with Gaza, Palestine, to the point where, as you heard in some of the clips that I had there, no matter what you say to them, everything, and you heard it in Corbin as well, everything is always circular, everything always comes back to the evils of Israel or the evils of Netanyahu, many of which, the how bad it is, many right-thinking people would agree with. But what it's done is that it's opened up that kind of being so uncompromising, so unyielding, has opened up this space on the right and on the far right for them to get into the frankly invidious, unbelievable position of expressing themselves and setting themselves up as a kind of not only guarantor of British Jewry, but also the kind of guarantor of British respect and identity. And that is where Suella Braverman was wrong. What not only she did, but the government did in a week leading up to that march, was to elide the idea of this march being instinctively and inherently anti-remembrance. And in doing that, which isn't true, actually, that wasn't true, that wasn't the flaw with that march. In so doing, it opened up the space for the far right and Robinson and all of that gang of thugs to set themselves up as the guarantor and as the custodian and the protector of British identity and British remembrance in opposition to that group of marchers. And Suella Braverman and the government was completely part of that process.
The spectre of Corbyn sitting there unable to call Hamas a terrorist group brings us, I guess, to where the Labour Party is today, or rather tomorrow. We're expecting this vote on whether Labour should call for a ceasefire or not. And this is going to be quite difficult if a lot of the front benchers, the shadow front benchers, decide that they will. It would go against where their leader sits. I hear that the SNP are now changing the amendment and that Labour doesn't yet know what the new wording is or whether the Speaker will select it. And Labour feel that this is a trap being set for them by the SNP. This is not about solving Middle East policy, it's about creating problems for Labour.
I mean, when you say they're setting a trap for Labour, and I'm not attacking the SNP by what I'm about to say, but I just think this is so bloody depressing that things are bad enough at the moment without playing it for party political advantage when you have got a national kind of crisis like this, the polarisation that we saw at the weekend, the situation in Israel and Gaza, to play SNP Labour politics with it, to do any of these things, it's just puerile.
It's also not as if Netanyahu's waiting to see what the Labour front bench do before he pulls off the IDF.
That's
right?
true. What is true to say is that there is deep division and unease within the Parliamentary Labour Party.
Oh, of course.
About Keir Starmer's position, and David Lammy was at the PLP last night, and by all accounts had quite a difficult time from lots of MPs who want to see Starmer take a more assertive position on calling for a ceasefire or getting close to wording which gets close to it. And in a way, because of, and this has been part of Downing Street's frustration why Braverman is no longer in her job, because of all of the problems she caused last week and the ramping up of the rhetoric and so on, we have been distracted from that and from that story, which would have been a bigger story, which is Labour's internal divisions, and instead focusing on Conservative ones, which actually, in terms of the substance of Israel and Gaza, are barely there. So it is bound to be a bigger story over the next 24 hours.
I think Labour will be devastated that Suella's gone, quite frankly.
And you just look at the space that Keir Starmer was given by Suella Braverman, where Labour was under pressure over Gaza and what should happen next, and suddenly Labour presents itself as the friend of the police force that is standing right behind the Metropolitan Police at this difficult time, and it is the Tories that are piling in on the Met. I mean, what a ridiculous turnaround that was.
The Met actually played a blinder at the weekend. I actually thought everything that I saw in terms of the police.
And
they often get it wrong.
They've got public sympathy back on.
And they often get it wrong, and we should say when they got it right. They actually walked the tightest of tight ropes in terms of balancing free expression and maintaining public order. And the fact is, and the Prime Minister can't say it, but the Home Secretary was completely complicit in making that problem worse.
Technically, I think a tightrope is easier to walk than a slack tightrope.
I've got a little present for you, Emily. Look at this. Look at this. Now, obviously, this only works for those watching on YouTube, but...
turn it round. Look at the back of it.
Take a look at this, folks. This is our first newsagent's hoodie, which, along with other newsagents-related merchandise, perfect for Christmas, you will be able to buy very shortly.
First, we've actually had to keep that in a safe because it is the only one.
Well, such is the demand. There's thousands of people outside currently clamouring, all the 100%ers, all the saddos, clamouring to get it. So you've got to put it on.
I'm going to put this on right now.
Apparently, it only just fits John, so we've only got one.
Oi! Don't be cheeky to me. Don't you be lippy to me. Don't fat shame me.
If I can't get in this
hoodie.
There we go.
Vogue,
you look like you're about to go.
Heart out.
You look like you're about to go and occupy the cenotaph.
Well, I think this is in honour of David Cameron, isn't it? It's Hug a Hoodie Week.
Oh yes.
Yeah. You see?
Something we have to hug her?
No.
Well, that's okay, fine.
No, it's not polite.
You'll be able to go. Link to where you can buy them in the episode description today. Perfect for every newsagent's fan.
And there are going to be bottles, water bottles, books, phone covers,
phone cases.
Oh, you've got the lot.
We do treat you.
You can be a newsagent too.
And also, it's great because if you do happen to run a chain of newsagents, you just give them to your staff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because it says I'm a newsagent on them.
We should flog them to W.H. Smith.
Yeah, Londis, if you're listeing, we can do a job lot.
Bulk deal.
No problem.
Bulk deal.
John will negotiate.
Discounts for bulk.
And you thought we hated doing ads.
See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.